If you're running a Windows 11 machine tied to a business or enterprise Microsoft 365 license, there's a real chance Copilot has already landed on your desktop this month. And you never clicked install. No pop-up, no terms and conditions screen. No, would you like to try our new AI assistant banner? It's simply there, pinned to your taskbar, sitting in your start menu, exactly as if you had gone looking for it and installed it yourself. That's not speculation. That's what's happening right now in July 2026 across millions of managed Windows devices. And I want to walk you through exactly how it works, why it's happening again, and, more importantly, exactly how a growing number of IT administrators and everyday users are shutting it down. Before we get into the mechanics, I need you to understand something. This is not new behavior from Microsoft. This is the third time in roughly 2 years. The company has tried some version of this exact move, and understanding that pattern is the key to understanding why so many people are furious about it right now, instead of just shrugging it off as one bad rollout. Rewind to early 2024. Microsoft quietly announced through an internal message center post that admins refer to by its tracking number MC698136, that the Microsoft 365 Copilot app would begin installing automatically the moment users updated their Office desktop apps through the current channel. No admin action required, no user prompt. The company's own internal pitch for this was that it would seamlessly bring the power of generative AI to every knowledge worker, which, translated out of corporate speak, means we don't want to wait for you to decide you want this. We're just going to put it there and let you discover it. The backlash was immediate. IT departments flooded Microsoft's own feedback channels and public forums, complaining about software appearing on managed devices they hadn't approved, hadn't tested, and in a lot of cases hadn't even budgeted for. Compliance teams raised alarms because an app that could eventually touch Microsoft Graph, meaning emails, calendars, documents, internal chats, was showing up without going through any procurement or security review process at all. It was loud enough and sustained enough that Microsoft actually reversed course. By mid-March of this year, 2026, and there had already been an earlier pause before that, going back into 2025, Microsoft had backed off and made installation something admins and users opted into rather than something they had to actively block. For a while, that retreat got read by a lot of people in the Windows and IT community as a genuine concession. Maybe the company had actually absorbed the lesson that forcing software onto managed desktops without consent was a line you don't cross, even for something as strategically important to Microsoft as Copilot. Some coverage at the time even framed it as Microsoft listening to its enterprise customers. That reading did not age well, because starting in June 2026, Microsoft reversed itself again, and this time, according to reporting from multiple outlets tracking the change, the company's own admin portal explicitly states that users and organizations will now have to opt out if they don't want the Microsoft 365 Copilot app installed by default. Read that framing again, because it's doing a lot of work. Opt out, not opt in. The starting assumption, once again, is that Copilot belongs on your machine, and refusal is the thing you now have to go configure yourself. Here's the sharpest way I can put what's actually changed and what hasn't. Microsoft gave itself more lead time this round. It built more granular admin controls. It published clearer documentation on how to block the install ahead of the rollout window instead of scrambling to explain it afterward. Those are real, meaningful improvements in execution. But the fundamental decision underneath all of it, that Copilot should arrive by default and silence should be read as consent, never actually changed. This is a company iterating on how smoothly it can push something through, not a company reconsidering whether it should be pushing it through at all. And the timing detail matters a lot here too, because I want to be precise about dates rather than vague about sometime this summer. Multiple sources tracking the rollout put the first wave, the monthly enterprise channel, receiving the installation starting around June 9th through June 15th. The semi-annual enterprise channel preview picked it up around June 23rd. And by July 14th, just days before this video went live, Microsoft pushed broad deployment out to the semi-annual enterprise channel and essentially all remaining eligible builds. In other words, if your organization runs a slower, more conservative update cadence, specifically to avoid exactly this kind of surprise, that strategy has already run out of runway. The wave has reached nearly everyone eligible. So here's the question I want you sitting with as we move into the next section, because it's the one that actually matters for your day-to-day. How does an app get onto potentially millions of managed business devices without a single consent screen, without a separate installer, without even hitting the Windows Store? The answer is almost more unsettling than the fact that it's happening at all, because it means the very update systems IT departments trust to keep their machines secure and current are the same systems being used to deliver software nobody asked for. That's exactly where we're headed next. The actual technical delivery mechanism, why even cautious organizations got caught off guard despite Microsoft's supposedly improved warning system, and the one detail buried in Microsoft's own documentation about unlicensed devices that I think deserves a lot more attention than it's gotten so far. Before we get there, quick gut check. If you've already noticed a Copilot icon appear on your taskbar this month that you don't remember installing, drop a comment and tell me. I'm curious how widespread this actually is versus how loud the IT community discussion has been relative to real-world reach. Stick around, because the blocking methods in Section 2 are the part you're actually here for. Let's get into how this actually works technically, because understanding the delivery method explains almost everything about why so many IT departments got caught off guard, even the cautious ones who thought they'd insulated themselves months in advance. The Copilot app isn't delivered through a separate installer, and it isn't sitting in the Microsoft Store waiting for someone to click download. It rides inside the same servicing channel Microsoft already uses to push routine updates to your existing Office apps, specifically the click-to-run mechanism that Microsoft 365 apps already depends on to keep Word, Excel, PowerPoint, and Outlook current. That single design choice is the whole story. It means the app arrives disguised as business as usual. It doesn't look like a new install, it looks like Tuesday. And that detail matters enormously because, according to reporting on this rollout, even organizations that had deliberately paused feature updates for Office, specifically to avoid exactly this kind of surprise, could still see Copilot appear. In some configurations, it's been classified closer to an optional quality update rather than a feature update, which means it can slip through a different gate than the one admins thought they'd locked. The rollout itself has moved in the staged waves I mentioned in Section 1, monthly enterprise channel first, around June 9th to June 15th, then the semi-annual enterprise channel preview around June 23rd, and finally, broad deployment to the semi-annual enterprise channel and virtually all remaining eligible builds by July 14th. That last wave is the one that's dominating IT forum threads right now because it's the point where organizations running the slowest, most conservative update cadence, the ones who genuinely believed they'd bought themselves months of runway, found out that runway had quietly run out. Now here's the detail I think deserves far more attention than it's gotten in most of the coverage this month. Reporting indicates the rollout was originally scoped for tenants holding Copilot licenses, but a configuration issue caused it to also reach environments without any Copilot license at all. Unlicensed users ended up seeing the app appear, some of them attempting to sign in, generating support tickets, and triggering security teams to flag it as unsanctioned software, sitting on devices it was never authorized for. Sit with what that actually means from a pure governance standpoint. Microsoft is placing an application that, in its fully licensed form, integrates deeply with Microsoft Graph, meaning it can eventually touch your emails, your documents, your calendar, your team's conversations, onto devices that, in some cases, never asked for it and never paid for it. It just sits there anyway, taking up space, becoming one more thing your IT department has to inventory, secure, and account for in a compliance audit, whether anyone in the building ever clicks on it or not. That's the backdrop driving the wave of blocking activity happening right now. So let's actually get into how people are fighting back, because this is the part you came for. If you're an IT administrator managing a fleet of machines, the most centralized option is the Microsoft 365 Apps Admin Center itself. Under Customization, Device Configuration, there's a toggle that functions as the fastest blanket solution if you're managing this at scale and want one switch rather than touching individual device policies. For organizations still running traditional Active Directory group policy rather than fully cloud-managed environments, Microsoft has shipped a dedicated administrative template entry for this. It shows up under Administrative Templates, Microsoft 365 Apps, with a policy along the lines of Prevent automatic installation of Microsoft 365 Copilot. Enabling it blocks the automatic install alongside your regular Office suite deployment, but you need the latest ADMX and ADML template files imported first. If you're not seeing the policy in your group policy editor, that's almost certainly why. For Intune managed endpoints, the same underlying block ships as a device configuration profile, searchable under something like block. Microsoft 365 Copilot app in the settings catalog. Assign it to all devices or a targeted device group, and Microsoft's own documentation says it applies during the next sync cycle, typically within about 8 hours, though some admin guidance suggests allowing up to 24 hours to be safe. And for smaller environments, scripted deployments, or admins who want something they can push immediately without waiting on policy replication, there's a direct registry path. HKLM software policies, Microsoft Office 16.0 Commoner Copilot, with a DUORD value blocking. Installation. This takes effect immediately without a reboot, and Microsoft has confirmed the click-to-run installer checks this key before attempting the install. If you're running Configuration Manager instead of Intune, that same registry logic can be pushed as a custom configuration profile. Now, here's the piece I think matters most if you're reading this as an individual rather than someone managing hundreds of machines, because a lot of the coverage on this has been written entirely from the corporate IT perspective. If Copilot has already appeared on your taskbar and you don't have organization-wide policy control, you can still go into Word, Excel, or PowerPoint, Open File, Account Privacy, Manage Settings, and turn off the option that lets connected experiences analyze your content. It's not a purpose-built Copilot kill switch. It's a broader privacy control that also affects things like suggested replies in Outlook, but it meaningfully limits what Copilot can actually do, even with the icon still visible. If you just want the icon and ribbon button gone from your daily view, File, Options, Customize Ribbon lets you toggle the Copilot entry off directly, no registry editor required. But here's the uncomfortable part, and it's exactly where Section 3 picks up. Multiple sources covering this rollout are explicit that setting one of these blocks today is not a permanent self-sustaining wall. It's a gate you have to keep actively maintaining, because the moment a future update changes the underlying detection logic, Copilot can slip back in through the same door you thought you'd locked. So let's sit with that uncomfortable detail from the end of Section 2, because it's genuinely one of the most important things buried in Microsoft's own documentation on this rollout. The block you configure today only prevents the initial forced installation. Subsequent updates to the app, if it's already present on a device, may still be delivered through normal update channels, regardless of your original block. In plain terms, blocking the install is not a switch you flip once and forget. It's a gate you have to keep checking, because the moment your policy lapses, gets misconfigured after a future Office update changes the underlying detection logic, or simply gets overlooked when a new device gets provisioned, Copilot can quietly slip back in through the same servicing channel that let it in the first time. That's why multiple sources tracking this rollout are recommending what's essentially a defense-in-depth approach, layering the admin center, toggle, group policy, or Intune enforcement, and a registry-level block together rather than relying on any single method. Admins who set blockers back during the 2024 or 2025 pause windows are specifically being told to go back and confirm those policies are still active and haven't been silently superseded by newer ADMX templates or a changed policy path. It's the digital equivalent of checking that a lock you installed months ago hasn't quietly been rekeyed without your knowledge. Now, here's a wrinkle in this story that I think reveals more about Microsoft's actual thinking than almost anything else in this entire rollout. And it's the kind of detail that gets buried under the technical how-to guides. If you're a Windows or Microsoft 365 user inside the European Economic Area, none of this forced installation applies to you. EEA devices are explicitly exempted from the automatic Copilot rollout. And that's not Microsoft being generous, it's Microsoft complying with the EU's Digital Markets Act and the broader European privacy and platform regulation framework, which impose real enforceable financial consequences on exactly this kind of default on opt-out only software deployment. Sit with that for a second, because it tells you something important about what's actually driving these decisions at Microsoft. The companies isn't sitting in a room asking itself, should we force this on to people without asking first? It's asking, where are we legally required to ask first, and where can we get away with not asking? In the EEA, regulators have already answered that question with real teeth behind it. In the EU, United States and most of the rest of the world, no equivalent regulatory framework currently exists to stop this kind of rollout. So it doesn't get stopped. That's the entire difference. Not a technical limitation, not a goodwill gesture, a jurisdiction by jurisdiction risk. Calculation, and users outside Europe are effectively absorbing that calculation on Microsoft's behalf, whether they realize it or not. Now let's zoom out, because I don't think this is really a story about one app or one summer's rollout at all. This is now the third time in roughly 2 years, Microsoft has pushed some version of forced or default on Copilot deployment, been met with real, sustained backlash, pulled back temporarily, and then returned with a more refined version of the exact same underlying strategy. That's not a company second-guessing whether the approach is right. That's a company iterating on execution while keeping the core decision completely fixed in place. And when you look at how Microsoft is publicly framing this rollout, the language is telling in itself. The company's official messaging describes the forced install as something that simplifies discovery and adoption for users. Read that phrasing carefully because it reveals the underlying philosophy driving the whole strategy. Microsoft has decided Copilot adoption matters enough that leaving it to actual user intent, meaning people choosing to go seek it out and install it because they genuinely want it, isn't an acceptable path to get there anymore. Discovery, in Microsoft's framing, apparently works better when the software is already sitting on your desktop before you've expressed a shred of interest in it. There's a very real business logic underneath this too, and understanding it explains why Microsoft keeps circling back to this exact playbook instead of trying something entirely different. Microsoft 365. Copilot, as an add-on license, carries meaningful per-user monthly pricing, historically priced around the $30 per user range for enterprise seats. Rather than IT departments proactively evaluating whether it's worth that cost and formally purchasing licenses top-down, the app is simply already there, sitting on employees' desktops, generating exactly the kind of organic internal demand that makes it far easier for individual employees to walk into their IT department asking, "Can I get access to this thing that's already on my computer?" instead of IT having to pitch brand new software nobody's seen yet. That's a fundamentally different sales motion than traditional enterprise procurement, arguably a genuinely clever one from a pure business strategy lens, even though it comes directly at the expense of the choice IT departments and end users would otherwise have had in the matter. So where does this actually leave you practically, depending on which side of this you're sitting on right now? If you're an IT administrator and you haven't configured a block yet, the single most urgent thing to do is stop treating this as a one-time fix and start treating it as ongoing policy maintenance. Set your block using at least two of the available methods together: the Admin Center toggle plus Either group, policy or a registry-enforced Intune profile, so you're not relying on a single point of failure. Then schedule an actual recurring check, monthly is reasonable, to confirm the block is still active and hasn't been quietly undone by a subsequent Office update changing the underlying detection logic. If you're an individual user on a machine without centralized policy control and Copilot has already appeared, start with the ribbon customization to hide the button from daily view, then go into account privacy and turn off connected experiences, understanding you're trading away a few convenience features along with it. And if you're simply frustrated by the pattern itself, more than any single instance of it, know this is very likely not the last time this exact fight happens, which is exactly where we're headed next. What this pattern looks like when you place it next to what Microsoft's biggest rivals are actually doing with AI on their own platforms, and what Microsoft's own roadmap signals about where this is heading over the next year. Let's close this out by putting Microsoft's approach next to what its two biggest rivals are actually doing with AI on their own platforms, because the contrast is sharper than most of the coverage on this story bothers to point out, and it tells you a lot about whether Microsoft's strategy here is really about technical necessity or simply about what the company has calculated it can get away with. Apple's approach with Apple Intelligence on macOS and iOS has been built around explicit opt-in from day one, a setup screen during onboarding that asks directly whether you want it enabled, with granular control over what gets processed on device versus what gets sent to Apple's servers. Google's approach with Gemini across Workspace has leaned more toward feature-level toggles inside individual apps, rather than a background application silently appearing on your desktop without warning. Neither company is meaningfully behind Microsoft on underlying AI capability. Apple Intelligence and Gemini are both genuinely competitive products in their own right, which tells you the forced, default-on installation approach we've walked through this entire video isn't a technical requirement for AI adoption at all. It's a specific choice. Microsoft is making one that its two largest competitors in this exact race have both decided against, at least for now, in their own consumer and enterprise ecosystems. I think it's worth being honest about why that structural difference exists rather than just noting it. Apple controls both the hardware and the software end-to-end, and a huge share of its revenue comes directly from consumers choosing to buy Apple products because they trust the experience, which creates a real incentive to protect that trust rather than erode it with unwanted software. Microsoft's position is structurally different. Windows ships pre-installed on hardware from Dell, HP, Lenovo, and dozens of other manufacturers, reaching users who never actively chose Windows as a brand the way an iPhone buyer actively chose Apple. Windows also dominates the enterprise desktop market in a way iOS and macOS simply don't, which means Microsoft's real paying customer, the one actually generating the recurring revenue this entire Copilot push is chasing, sits with IT departments and corporate licensing agreements, not with the individual employee sitting in front of the keyboard every day. When your actual paying customer is a CIO signing an enterprise agreement rather than the person using the machine, the incentive to prioritize that individual user's explicit consent naturally weakens. I think that structural difference explains a lot about why Microsoft keeps returning to this playbook even after real documented backlash, each time it's tried before. There's also a useful historical parallel worth understanding here because it clarifies where this is likely heading, and that's the Windows. Recall story from 2024. When Microsoft first announced recall, the AI feature that continuously screenshots your activity to build a searchable history of everything you've done on your PC, the backlash was immediate, loud, and came heavily from security researchers rather than just IT forums. Microsoft delayed the launch, rebuilt significant parts of the underlying security architecture, and eventually shipped it as something much closer to genuinely opt-in. That's a real example of sustained public pressure actually reshaping a Microsoft AI rollout in a meaningful, structural way, not just delaying it by a few weeks and then quietly resuming the same plan. Copilot's forced install saga has followed a noticeably different arc. Backlash has repeatedly produced only a temporary pause, followed by a more refined version of the same underlying default, rather than the kind of fundamental architectural rethink Recall eventually got. Whether that's because the stakes feel lower to the public, a background app icon simply feels less alarming than a feature that's continuously screenshotting your entire digital life, or because Microsoft has calculated that IT admin frustration doesn't carry the same reputational cost as a full-blown security researcher backlash, is genuinely hard to say for certain. But the pattern so far strongly suggests Copilot's forced installs will keep coming back in slightly improved form rather than disappearing the way Recall's most aggressive original design choices did. So here's where I think this actually leaves things, looking forward rather than just back at what's already happened this summer. Microsoft's own public roadmap commentary has already signaled that future Windows versions may integrate Copilot even more deeply into the core shell itself, potentially reaching a point where it functions less like an optional app you can block through group policy, and more like a fundamental system component. The same status OneDrive and Windows security effectively hold today, nominally removable in theory, but practically treated as permanent infrastructure by both Microsoft and most IT departments in practice. If that trajectory holds, the blocking methods we walked through in Section 2, genuinely effective as they are right now, this week, in July 2026, may have a shrinking shelf life. That's not a reason to skip setting them up today. If Copilot's forced presence isn't something you want on your systems, you should absolutely still configure that defense in depth block right now. But it is a reason to stay engaged with this story rather than treating any single opt-out guide as a permanent one-time solution you configure once and forget about forever. The real long-term lesson here isn't actually about Copilot specifically at all. It's about recognizing a pattern that's quietly becoming standard practice across major software platforms in general, where deep AI integration increasingly arrives as the assumed default state, and genuine choice becomes something you have to actively seek out, configure, and continuously defend, rather than something you're ever actually asked about directly and upfront. So here's my honest question for you, and I'd genuinely like to know: does forced but blockable count as a fair trade-off for faster AI adoption, or is opt-out by default simply the wrong starting point, no matter how good the blocking documentation gets? Drop your take in the comments. I'm curious how split the opinions actually are on this one, because from what I've read across IT forums this week, it is not close to unanimous. If tracking exactly how these AI rollouts play out and exactly how real people push back against them is useful to you, subscribe, because this fight over what belongs on your desktop by default is clearly not finished. Not on Windows, not anywhere else in tech right now.